Guys, welcome back. Continuation still. After the neurons, let's see you. We continue now to the reflex action and the reflex arc that we did talk to when we started our lesson. The important words or the key words there, we've got the reflex arc. This is the pathway along which the impulse is transmitted to bring about response to the stimuli. Now, when I give you this definition, you are having a neuron in your mind, I believe. Then we've got the reflex action. There's a difference between the arc and the action. Reflex action takes place because the reflex arc is there. What is this reflex arc? The path of the pathway of the impulse. So reflex action. It's a very quick, automatic response to the stimuli. Why quick, automatic? The reflex action should be quick or immediate to avoid severe injury. Why do I say that? If you step on a pin, you cannot think about it to say, oh, this pin, I feel pain. Immediately, you pull your foot away from that pin. That's the reflex action. The impulse went through the reflex arc. Let's see now. I gave examples there that when you sneeze, you don't think about sneezing. Because we said, again, it's automatic. You just sneeze. The removing of your body part, I gave an example when you step on a pin. There comes the reflex action and the reflex arc. Pathway of impulse and the action, meaning the response that is automatic and very quick to avoid severe injury. So if we look at this, you can see that. We've got the stimulus here, which is hot object. Then what is happening here? If you look at this diagram, you can see we've got the receptor that would be your finger that touches the hot part, and what is going to happen? The impulse will be carried by, remember what type of a neuron carries this impulse from the sensory organs? That will be your sensory neuron. And then the direction we set is to the spinal cord. Then it will move. Then what is going to happen when the sensory neuron transmits that impulse? Remember, it was a stimulus from the beginning because it's still in the atmosphere, in the environment. But once it gets into the sense organ, we've got it will be converted into an impulse that will be able to be carried by the neuron to the spinal cord. Then, what is going to happen there? The impulse will be transmitted to the interneuron. Remember the function of the interneuron? From the interneuron, it will now, the interpretation of the impulse will be carried by the motor neuron. Remember, motor neuron is carrying impulse from the spinal cord. And then this motor neuron will carry this impulse through this blue. It gets to the muscle here, which is referred to as an effector. So once the impulse gets to the effector, that would be your muscle. The muscle will contract. Why contract? It responds to the impulse. So once the muscle contracts, you know the function of the muscles, it's for movement. Once it contracts, then you'll move your hand away from the hot object. That is reflex action through the impulse moved through the reflex arc to give us a reflex action, a quick response. Now let's see if you understood the reflex action and the reflex arc by answering the following questions. Number one, it says you give only the letter, But the first thing that you do, don't forget you have to study the diagram for you to be able to answer the questions. So the first question there, the question said give only the letter of the part that does what? That represents sensory neuron. Then you go back to the diagram for you to get the correct answer. Before you can go to the correct answer, you must remember the function of the sensory neuron. Carries impulse to the spinal cord. So what would be the answer? Already I reminded you. So the answer will be B. Let's see if you are right. Yes, it is carried from here. It gets into the spinal cord. So the direction is to the spinal cord. Number B says you give the letter of that part that represents the dorsal root of the spinal nerve. Remember I said D comes before the V. So it is at the top because D comes before V. So what will be your answer? You go back to the diagram and look at the diagram. Then you'll get the correct answer as what? As C. This is the top part of the spinal cord. Then we move to number C, that part that represents an effector. Remember, the motor neuron carries impulse to the effector. So we're looking at the diagram here. Where will be our effector? These are muscles, I believe. Then already I gave you direction to answer, to give answer. That will be A. Yes, A is the muscle, is the effector. Then we move to the second question. You write down letters only for the pathway that the impulse will take until a response occurs. The example, we did that. We must see the impulse from the sensory organ through the sensory neuron into the interneuron to the motor neuron and to the effector. That is the direction. Then let's see if our direction is correct. But they said you should give only letters. We said it's the neuron here, which is the sensory neuron, through the D here, which is the interneuron, to the G here, which takes the impulse to the effector. That would be your motor neuron. Then the next question, explain one consequence for the reflex action if part D has been damaged. Where's part D? We are talking about this part D, the interneuron. If it is damaged, explain. Remember the verb explain, you give the cause and effect. So let's look at the answer here. The sensory neuron will transmit the impulse. Remember, from the sense organs to the sensory neuron, the impulse will be transmitted. Good. Then you get a mark for that. Then after the transmission of impulse from the sensory, by the sensory neuron from the sense organ, what will happen? Then the sensation will not be felt. Why? Because this part is damaged. Then what will happen? The body would not be able to do what? To respond. So this is the cause. Its sense will not be felt, so the body will not respond. I gave the cause and effect for the word, for the verb explain. The next question, it's another diagram still, but if you look at the diagram still, it gives us the diagram of the the reflex action on the reflex arc. The diagram along the side shows the reflex action. You give only letter of the part that is responsible, that represents the effector. That would be E. Let's look at E if we all agree that this will be our muscle as the effector. And then the letter that represents an interneuron from here, do we see any letter that shows us the interneuron here? I believe we see it, and the answer here will be A. We are right to say A. Now we move to number C, the letter that represents sensory neuron. Remember, we've got a finger here as our sense organ, and then we need that neuron that represents sensory neuron. So it must be a neuron from the sense organ. Let's follow it until we can see which one. Good. The answer should be C. Let's see if you are right. Yes, it's C. Then we move to the next question. It says you give the letter and the name of the neuron in the same diagram that is probably damaged if a person is able to detect the stimulus but cannot respond. Then, number 3, it says, the answer there is F. That is the motor neuron. Because the question said you give the letter and name of a neuron in the same diagram that we have that is probably damaged if a person is able to detect but cannot respond. So probably it should be F here, which is which type of a neuron? A motor neuron, because the impulse was able to be transmitted. Number 3, you state the nerve impulse that travels from D to E or from E to D. Then your diagram is key for you to look at the diagram before you answer the question. Then you're looking at D and E, or from E to D. Let's see the correct answer. The correct answer will be D to E, because it's from the sense organ and then to the interneuron impulse and back to the effector for response. So the correct answer is D to E. That is the correct sequence or the correct direction. Guys, we did the reflex action and the reflex arc. I think now we need to take a break so that you absorb exactly everything that we did. Now, let's go grab a glass of water. We'll come back. Thank you.